Hey guys, welcome into the channel. Today we are finishing our series on the Iraq War. We're wrapping up the series on the War on Terror. What are the takeaways here? Where are we going moving forward? So what are some of the lessons we can take away from the invasions of Afghanistan and the invasions of Iraq? Well, the first lesson we can take away is this. You have to be so clear what victory looks like before you engage into a war, particularly when it's a war of occupation and rebuilding. I'm not certain. In fact, I'm pretty sure that the U.S. government, the Bush administration, didn't actually have a finite endpoint in mind of what it would look like to achieve victory in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And so in Afghanistan, the question is, why did we invade Afghanistan? Was it to root out the Taliban? Was it to kick out Al-Qaeda? Yes, it definitely was that, but was it also to back an Afghani government, a democratically elected big government? I mean, yes and no. You kind of have to have the government if you want to put in the political process in place to make sure people and tribal leaders in Afghanistan don't turn to the Taliban, but was it the right thing to put in a big federalized government? These are the types of questions that I don't think the U.S. government wrestled with enough. They kind of invaded Afghanistan because that's where the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda were, the people who attacked us on September 11th. That's where they were. We invaded when we got there, and we achieved a very quick and stunning victory. We were kind of left saying, okay, well, what next? We didn't really handle the state building operation because we didn't have a clear vision of what it would look like, what victory would look like. In Iraq, the question is, did we invade to topple Saddam? Did we invade to get the WMDs that were never there? Did we invade to root out the terrorism threat? Or did we invade to do regime change? What does regime change looks like? What does democracy look like? When do we know we can pull out? I mean, all these questions, I don't think the American government had actually fully understood, fully wrestled with and said, look, this is what it looks like. This is what the end game looks like. When we achieve X, Y, and Z, then we can pull out. So that's the first lesson to learn. The second lesson is occupation is very costly and it's very ineffective. We should not be occupying other countries. And if you do, you should be prepared to stay there for a long, long, long time. The case in point of this lesson throughout history was the United States and the Western powers occupying West Germany, Soviet Union occupying East Germany, and the United States occupying and rebuilding Japan. It wasn't just a few-year effort and then we got up and left. We stayed there. We still have bases all over Germany. We still have bases all over Japan. You just have to be prepared if you're going to be occupying these countries to stay there and expend the kind of political and material cost that it's going to take to rebuild these countries. Other lessons include getting your intelligence rights. When your justification for going to war is that a certain regime has weapons of mass destructions and you invade and it turns out they don't, the credibility of your intelligence agencies and your country as a whole really goes down a notch because hundreds of thousands of people died, and the whole reason you went to war in the first place, WMDs, the Saddam Hussein regime's connection to terrorist organizations, turned out to be false. And so it looks like the legitimacy of your effort in the country, it's not very legitimate. You have to understand the local dynamics in Afghanistan. You have to understand the local tribal dynamics in Iraq. We should have understood the deep sectarian divide between the Sunni and the Shia and the potential for sectarian conflict in that country. The final lesson we'll discuss today, and I've said many other lessons throughout the episodes if you want to go back, I'm talking about the limits of effective air power, how effective can air power be in actually changing the dynamics of warfare, understanding the differences between a counterterrorism strategy and a counterinsurgency strategy, and when you need to employ those different strategies in different situations. But the final lesson we want to cover here is the need for international coalitions and international support. The U.S. importantly had that in Afghanistan. In Iraq, the United States did not have that. Did not have international support, did not have international legitimacy, and as cumbersome as international support can be, it still lends a lot of credibility to your cause. I mean, I think it was Winston Churchill who said, the only thing worse than fighting in a coalition is fighting without a coalition. Now, to end our series on the War on Terror, and specifically to end our series on the Iraq War, the last thing I want to say as the realist is this. I'm really quite disappointed, just as an individual citizen, in the lack of responsibility that senior figures in the Bush administration have had to go through, and I'm disappointed that the United States Congress, the government of the United States, hasn't actually instituted an in-depth, thorough report, a process of how all these decisions and how all the mistakes that were made happened in the Bush administration. Now, granted, the U.S. government has produced a report on the intelligence failures that led to the invasion of Iraq, but that's only one small little piece of the pie about the complete debacle, fiasco, as Thomas Ricks put it, of Iraq. What I think needs to happen is there needs to be a thorough investigation of the motives, the initial motivations of the Bush administration going to war. I mean, even on the day of September 11th, people in the Bush's cabinet were already thinking about, was this Iraq? Is there a connection with Iraq? When most people in the intelligence community were saying, no, this is absolutely ridiculous. This was Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda through and through. So why was there such a fixation on Iraq? What led to the decision to only have a certain amount of forces, only 160,000 forces invading Iraq, when many people said, and even one of the top army officials said, you'd need 400,000 or 500,000 people? Why did Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and the Bush administration decide to just jettison that advice and invade with a small force and think that they could just walk into Iraq and democracy would just magically appear, would just shoot up like the freshly budded flowers of spring? Why was the Coalition Provisional Authority government so inept at actually rebuilding Iraq? Why was there so much corruption through the proliferations of U.S. government funds through the Coalition Provisional Authority into the Iraqi society? There was a lot of corruption. We weren't even able to cover that, but that needs to be looked at as well. There's many other issues, many other mistakes that I think the U.S. government should have looked at, should have produced reports on. My problem is, if we don't do this, if a government does not have this sort of self-awareness, this sort of ability to critique itself, it's doomed to repeat this in the future. And that's really what I want. I don't want to drag Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney out and flog them in the middle of Times Square and put them in prison on war crimes, though if evidence surfaces that they did commit war crimes, it would not be necessarily bad to indict somebody if they committed war crimes. I'm not saying they did. What I am saying is the U.S. government must take responsibility for its mistakes. And I think the individual people, the Cheneys, the Rumsfeld, the Bushes, they need to take responsibility and say, hey, look, we made some mistakes. Our fundamental assumptions about why we should have fought the war and our initial way of engaging in warfare were wrong, and we apologize. We take responsibility. I think Bush has done that a little bit, and you can see that when he announces the surge in early January 2007. He has a speech and he says, look, some of the disorder, of the chaos that's happening, any mistakes that were made, I take responsibility for. But that's not really enough. I think there needs to be a government-sanctioned, government-sponsored, full investigation of every aspect of the war in Iraq. Why? It's so that we can avoid, the U.S. and other governments throughout the rest of history can avoid the type of mistakes that we made in engaging in a war in Iraq. That's so, so important. And as a little bit of a side note here, maybe it can provide a little bit of justice to the, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who died, and the only reason they died was because of the U.S.'s decision to invade Iraq. Had the U.S. not invaded Iraq, had they not handled the invasion as they handled it, these hundreds of thousands of people would not have died. Yes, they would have lived under Saddam Hussein, but the key point there is they would have lived under Saddam Hussein. So I think they would provide a little bit of justice. I think this kind of thorough review, this thorough investigation would be helpful in providing experience and advice for future policymakers going forward to avoid the kind of mistakes that the Bush administration made in choosing to and then engaging in war in Iraq. Because, and this is the last point, some catastrophic event will probably happen in the future. It might happen in the US, might happen in Europe, it might happen to China. I mean, it could happen anywhere. Given human history, it's a very high likelihood that something like this will happen. And the point is, just as 9/11 was so catastrophic, you don't want your leaders to overreact. You don't want your leaders to make the kind of brash, emotional decisions, ideological decisions that the Bush administration made, and those decisions have the far-reaching consequences, negative consequences they have had. If the Bush administration had followed more of a realist perspective to actually sit down and look at the facts as they are instead of how we would like them to be. All right, guys, so that's the end of the War on Terror. We're done with this on our History Mondays. We're moving forward. We're going into a new series on the history of China, going back from sort of the mid-1800s all the way today. We're really excited. We're really looking forward to it. So stay tuned, subscribe to the channel, share the videos, and remember, as always, reality always trumps ideology.